Good morning. Hi, I'm Stacy Vaughn, and I'm a AFCEA volunteer here, and I have the pleasure of introducing your guest speaker. But just a little housekeeping. The presentation is approved by one comp TIA, a CEU, or one GIA CPE, CPE, and you do not get the credit until you sit here for 60 minutes, just a FYI. So if you guys have any questions, please, we'll do that afterwards. And we look forward to hearing great information that Russ Smith has. So here's our speaker.
All right. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate you all coming out. By way of introduction, I did serve in the Air Force. I retired in 2016. I was a Deputy 6 at SOCOM and spent some time in some tactical comm units, both at JCSC and in the 5th Combat Comm Group. And one of the things that we were always challenged with was, how do you make information available to the tactical edge? And the title of the presentation, Beans, Bullets, and Bytes, I'll give a little shout out to Chad Ott, who is a recent hire at Zscaler. Chad is a former Army officer, and it was really his idea to come up with this term. So, truth be told, I did steal it, but it's good. And what it really kind of points us towards is the idea of the logistical challenges of moving information to the tactical edge as well as across the battlefield. So I'm going to make some connections here that may be something that you haven't heard before. I'm going to talk about some things that I think may make some folks a little bit uncomfortable, just from the sense that, it kind of falls into that category of, well, this is the way we've always done it. So hopefully that'll kind of open the aperture a little bit and get you thinking about zero trust in a slightly different way. So from an agenda perspective, as I said, we're going to cover some of those logistical challenges. But the reason why it's such a unique challenge in the Department of Defense is because cyber is a constructed domain. And that sort of thought process has fallen out of favor, but back in the early 2000s, when we were really grappling with how do we employ forces in and through cyber for effects on the battlefield, what really made cyber the same as the other warfighting domains, and then what made it unique. So I'm going to kind of take a step back a little bit and talk to you about kind of how we got to where we are right now with that thought around a constructed domain and what that really means. I'm going to talk about the DoD Zero Trust principles. So recently the department came out with their own version of a strategy around zero trust. And frankly, from our perspective, those of us that are in the cybersecurity business looking at zero trust, there was a lot of really good material in that DoD strategy. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Agile combat employment, I think is very topical right now. General Brown out at the Air Force Chief of Staff, who's fleeting up to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that was a focus area of his. I expect as he fleets up to become the chairman, it may become more of a focus area for the entire department. And then this idea of cyber lines of communication, I'm going to go into a little more detail on what that means. And finally, I want to finish up with a use case around JADC2 and mission partner environment, and just how you can automate that process. And when we start to not think about coalition operations as a challenge in building and constructing mission partner networks, when you free yourself from that and you're really just thinking about, well, how do I get my coalition partners access to the needed coalition information that they require, zero trust really becomes the enabler to allow you to do that. And there's some really great things that are happening right now that allow us to automate that process and rapidly speed up the ability for us to get coalition information in the hands of coalition partners and fight tonight, instead of just building out the domain in order for them to be able to execute the mission. So I'm going to start where most people start when they're thinking about cybersecurity, with that great cyber strategist, Karl von Clausewitz. For those of you that maybe have spent some time in professional military education, that may create some angst. But so Karl von Clausewitz talked a lot about, as he observed Napoleon, talked a lot about this idea of lines of communication. And it was critical during the Napoleonic Wars, and then really, frankly, all wars after that, that all fielded forces have to have some way of moving bullets and beams to the front line, right? And so what I'm going to tie that into is how we get there in the cyber domain. We've seen in the Army what happens if you don't maintain your lines of communication. So go back to Desert Storm, and shout out to the Army. The Desert Storm did not last from February 24th to the 28th. There was actually a whole bunch of stuff that happened before that the Air Force was executing, but we'll skip over all that. The Army did in Desert Storm from February 24th to February 28th, cutting off all of the Iraqi forces' supplies. And if you remember, Colin Powell famously talked about how they were going to execute the war. They were going to cut the Iraqi forces' heads off and then kill it. But then when you look at the other domains and lines of communication, when you think about the Navy's ability to establish and protect lines of communication has to be done in a very, very tactical way. You cannot secure all of the oceans across the globe. It's impossible. So what the Navy has had to figure out is, well, how do you secure individual movement within those lines of communication? So you see here, there's these surveillance balloons that are up over all of these ships, and they're of course transiting through oceans, and they have a certain level of protection themselves, but they've not secured the entire ocean in order for them to transit across it. And the Air Force does the same thing. For those of you that maybe have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, you may have transited through an airfield like Manas Air Base, right, which was an air line of communication. It was a way of moving fielded forces through Manas into either the Afghanistan, primarily Afghanistan for Manas. But then we had other aerial ports of debarkation where we had established these lines of communication. Again, the Air Force cannot secure all of the air around the globe. They can only secure certain parts of it. And that's really where we want to focus from a zero trust perspective. How do we operate in the cyber domain and only secure what needs to be secured, but do it in a way that we leverage the entire domain? So going back a little bit, this is General Larry Welch, who was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and around the late 90s. And he went on to work at the Institute for Defense Analyses, and he thought a lot about cyberspace and how we operate in cyberspace. He made a lot of the correlations between cyber as a warfighting domain and all the other domains. And he said the similarities are, we all have to do some kind of passive defense, some kind of active defense, some kind of exploitation capability, some kind of attack. There's got to be the defining and developing needed capabilities. And then cyber brought with it that unique requirement to actually construct the domain. So that unique to cyber is how we construct the domain. And I think over time what's happened is that we think, well, I'm going to have to build out NIPRNet. If I'm going to operate within an unclassified networked environment, and there's always this, you always have this sense that networks are all connected, so therefore I have to own as much of the domain as I can in order to operate safely within it. And we have NIPRNet, we have SIPRNet, we have JWICS. So all of those networks then, in a sense, are like you're constructing that domain because you want to own all of that domain. But he was warning against that. You cannot be in the business of owning the entire cyber domain. And so we have struggled quite a bit because from a networking perspective, you cannot secure at the network level. You cannot secure information by securing your networks. It's just impossible to do it. The TCP/IP stack does not allow you to secure at the network layer. If you're familiar, if there's engineers in the room and you're familiar with the three-way handshake that TCP/IP has to do, there's got to be that knock on the door, and there's an acknowledgement that somebody is trying to access that network. Any network device, any internet-facing network device has to answer that call. Once that call is answered, there is an acknowledgement back to the individual that's trying to contact the network that, hey, I see you out there, I recognize who you are, let's do an exchange of security information in order for us to secure access to the network. Well, at that point, if you're familiar with Log4j, that's essentially what happened with Log4j. It was in that TCP IP handshake that created the logging entry then that launched the payload for the malicious software. So the point of that is that networking just does not allow you to secure information. So I posit this. What we need is we need the ability, not at the network layer, but we have to have the ability within the cyber domain to create cyber lines of communication. So we're leveraging areas that we can protect, but we're also fully leveraging areas that we may not be able to connect, that we're just passing through.
We actually use ATCTS as our system of records. That way we can ensure that our contractors are compliant. I have several talented programmers that actually can't do their jobs.
Do they get credit for both sessions then?
It's not really in the wheelhouse. So is 8140, are we authorized now to start utilizing that aside from ATCTS not having the updates yet?
Can you still hear me? Did you turn down this room as well? I think we're good. So if you've been tracking what's been going on in the discussions around zero trust and kind of how we got to where we are, it goes back to the Jericho Forum, if anybody's familiar with the Jericho Forum, and there's some other things that were happening prior to that, but basically there was a recognition on the part of CISOs, CIOs, security experts that, hey, a lot of our data is being moved into the cloud. The cloud was nascent, it was brand new. CISOs and CIOs recognized the power in the cloud. They recognized how much everybody is leveraging just basic internet connectivity. And so the Jericho Forum came together and said, we've got to figure out a way that we're not securing all of our data and information at the perimeter, at the enterprise boundary, because our data is not inside the enterprise boundary. Our data is being moved into the cloud. And they're being held on remote devices where people are logging into our network.
That's actually my old boss right there, so he's a good man. I got a lot of old bosses in here. But I just wanted to ask, along with your competitiveness when it comes to the certification process, a lot of my soldiers, they feel as though
you guys really should
not,
get credit for both. I'm just saying.
It's being tested based on their skill. I understand knowledge is a huge aspect of what we do as IT professionals, but we're more so doers. And that's what we do in the Army, that's what we do in DOD. We get after it, right? So when it comes to competitiveness, when it comes to being selected for certain things, do you all feel as though you're going to make modifications on the testing based on more hands-on, or are we going to continue to have more A, B, C, and D?
Did you? Yes. Come on, Pat. I think it's good. Okay, so cyber lines of communication, right? It's a way of thinking about getting information to the warfighter through the battlefield and do it in a way where you cannot control the entire domain. It's just impossible to do that. And zero trust really allows us to now go wherever, to have the security follow the user and follow those resources that those users need to get access to. As the Jericho Forum was highlighting, I need to be able to secure information no matter where I am accessing it, anytime. It has to be, and we talk about the 3 S's of security. Network independent, device independent, and location independent. 3 S's. Location independent security, device independent security,
Right.
and network independent security. So that's got to be the goal, and that's what really zero trust allows us to do. There's a guy by the name of John Kindervag. I don't know if you know who that is. That is not John Kindervag, but if there's some Office Space fans out there, you probably recognize him. So John Kindervag was talking a lot about how do I secure access regardless of where that information is. And he has a great analogy that he likes to use, and he puts up a picture of the Obama inauguration, and when President Obama was heading from the Capitol over to the White House, there's a picture of the beast that he was traveling in, and you can kind of see the different layers of defense around the beast. You had the metro. I think we're good. I think we're good now, unless you're hearing something. Thank you. Got a lot of engineers in the room, so. Kindervag really focused on that in that analogy that he used around the beast, and you see the DC cops that are kind of standing along Constitution Avenue, and they got their hands in their pockets, and they're kind of half paying attention and half not paying attention. And then as you get closer and closer to the beast, you see the Secret Service agents who do not have their hands in their pockets.
Thank you for going forward that way, because a lot of us that are crossing over to become warrant officers, we're starting to see how it's affecting the force. And like I said, more of us want to be doers instead of readers, completing an exam, and then putting it some way, and our skills aren't being utilized. So the more and more we do that. But thank you.
I think so. That's all right. I will give you yet another topic to discuss. That's all right, thanks.
This makes it spicy.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Kindervag, Constitution Avenue, the beast, as you get closer and closer to the president, obviously the protection levels start to ramp up. Your controls then of who can get access to the president, that's really where you want to focus, is where are those controls that are granting you access between a user and the resource they're trying to access. And you want to have those controls, much like in the inauguration, the route for the inauguration, you want those controls as close to the information that you're protecting as possible. And of course, at the network perimeter, you cannot do that, and that's why Zero Trust has really been the focus of not only the department, but across the Fed Civ agencies, and of course in the commercial space as well. But it's become really, really hard to do this for some reason. Well, for a lot of reasons. You can blame industry sometimes because an industry analysts that keep coming up with all these different terms. You've got CASB, which is focused on policy level enforcement in the cloud, and you've got software-defined perimeter, you've got software-defined wide area network, and you've got security services edge, and you've got secure access services edge. All of these different terms, when you start to dissect them, they're all trying to point you to zero trust, but they do things slightly different, and we kind of get bogged down in a lot of what industry is making available, because some of these companies are coming from their own perspective. They grew up doing certain things in the security business, and they've improved on that, and that's become part of their own zero trust story to tell. And it's not that that's wrong, it's just that it becomes very confusing because all the individual dicing and slicing of a zero trust architecture starts to get, well, if I get software-defined perimeter, am I zero trust? Well, you could be, but you may not be based on what else is in the environment. So our friends at NIST, of course, they came out with the Special Pub 800-207 to describe exactly what a zero trust architecture is. And I like this picture. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The idea is at the heart of your zero trust architecture is right here in the middle. It's what's happening around your control plane and around your data plane. And in your control plane, you've got to have some kind of policy decision point. There has to be some policy decision making going on to allow a user access to information. And then with that, you have to have some way of enforcing those policy decisions. I mean, at the heart of zero trust, it's that ability to establish policies and enforce those policies. All of this other stuff, while it's very critical, it's not alone going to get you to zero trust. Continuous diagnostic and monitoring, absolutely you have to do that. You have to be cognizant of what's going on from an industry compliance perspective. You have to have some way of feeding threat intel into your decision making. Part of your decision making could be what are some of the risks against those individuals, against those users, against those applications. So you have to have some cognizance of what's happening from a threat intel space perspective. Activity logs, you have to know what's going on and be able to react to adversary attempts at getting at your data. Data access policy, the IDAM ICAM, your PKI infrastructure, identity management. Shout out to all the security operations folks out there. You have to have some kind of SIM tool to help support security operations. But it really is kind of the context by which we're going to drive at our zero trust architecture. And how do we do the decision making and the decision enforcement in order to implement a zero trust architecture? Well, you have to terminate the connection. So now we're kind of getting a little more tactical on how you implement a zero trust solution. You have to know what is in those packets that are flowing throughout your environment, right? And so you have to decrypt the traffic. Well over 90% of all traffic on the internet is SSL or TLS encrypted. So there's no way of knowing if there's malware inside of that connection unless you break that connection and you open it up and you observe exactly what's inside of it. So you have to inspect that data. You have to identify the source. Where is this coming from? And where is that individual trying to go? And then you're starting to get to the meat of how you protect yourself. You have to verify by the identity of the user. And so there's some kind of identity management has to be in place in order to authorize the user to get certain accesses. Identify the data, identify the threats, and look at that context. Is this user suddenly popping up in Shanghai when they were in Toledo last night or three hours earlier? 3 hours earlier is probably a better example. But you have to understand the context of what that connection is really all about, and then broker it. And this is where we get to kind of harking back to that line of communication example. You want to monitor exactly what's happening from that user to the resource that they're trying to access and ensure that the policy is being enforced. And if anything starts to go awry, you need to be able to cut off that connection right away. That's really what zero trust is. It's the ability to get a user access to the information that they need. So the DoD came out and they had their own DoD strategy. And frankly, for those of us that are in this business, as I said before, we got very excited when we read this, primarily around principle number 1. And principle number 1 says that assume no implicit or explicit trusted zone in networks. In 800.207 in the NIST pub, they talk a lot about that implicit trust zone and shrinking that implicit trust zone as small as possible. The larger the implicit trust zone, the more lateral movement an adversary would have. So by shrinking it as small as possible, you then limit, in a lot of ways, the blast radius that the adversary could actually, damage that the adversary can inflict on you. Principles 2 and 3 are kind of tied together. They're basically saying there's some kind of identity management capability, and it's being strictly enforced, whether that's an individual reaching out and touching data in your environment, or machine-to-machine connectivity. You have to have some way of enforcing that connection as well. Principle number 4 talks about risk profiles and back to that context, understanding, is there something a little bit wrong here? Everything looks right, although the location of the individual is weird. We're not used to seeing that. So that risk score may drop, and then you may want to throw some additional multi-factor authentication at that user, let's say. But those are all happening by policy. If this individual shows up in a place that we're not expecting, do this. Doesn't mean you deny them access, but you may want to throw some additional challenges at that user to make sure they are who they say they are. All sensitive data is encrypted both at rest and in motion. That's a key tenet of 800-207. Principle number 6 talks to the monitoring. Again, shout out to all the security ops folks that are out there. You have to monitor, you have to collect data, you have to analyze that data. And then finally, policy management and distribution is centralized. And frankly, this is one place, policy management, that it's kind of tough to buy a tool that's going to do this. At some point, the customer has to step in and start making some very hard decisions on policy and who gets what. And you want to be able to somehow get to a point, you may start off with kind of like everybody has access to everything, and you monitor that over time, and you could start to get more and more granular on the decision making that you're applying against individual users. Once you start to see where, I've got this cluster of users that are always going to these HR systems, for instance, to use kind of a commercial example. So I can then start to limit their access and say only these people can get access to these applications. But that policy management has to be centralized, and somebody has to be able to monitor it. So as I said, this was a place that Principle 1, just diving in a little bit deeper on this. And really, when you start to think about NIPRNet, SIPRNet, JWICS, kind of the way we typically think in terms of how we construct the DoD domain, all these individual networks, and then what do we end up doing? Well, we need to share information across those networks. So what do? We build cross-domain solutions, and now we've got more complexity in the environment, and then we also have a risk that gets generated based on those CDSs. So is that the right approach, especially when the DoD is coming right out and saying, you can't expect any kind of security at the network boundary. So Principle 1 is foundational to that approach. No matter how many times you segment it, and that's another thing that comes up quite a bit. Well, I'll just keep segmenting my network and making it smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, what do you do? You're adding a whole bunch of appliances, tools, they may be software defined, but you're still adding more and more complexity to the environment. As I said, firewalls is the typical way that we do that, but more and more firewalls is not going to get you more security, it's going to get you a lot more complexity. So if you start to abstract out the network from your security and start to treat the network just as transport, now that frees us up to think about commercial 5G, commercial LEO, commercial, that whole category of satellite comms, any kind of commercial terrestrial network, missions that are in places where we do not have robust communications. The ability to hide in plain sight, the ability to go to an austere location and get a SIM chip from the local telco in some country in Africa, and now I don't have to worry. I should not be thinking about bringing my own infrastructure with me. I should be able to rely on the infrastructure that exists, and Zero Trust then allows me to leverage that transport and safely get back and securely get back to the information that I need. And as I said, so layers, principles 2 and 7 are really that framework that you want to build. But you've established the foundation that the network itself is strictly transport. Okay, so let's go into agile combat employment. So this is this is really interesting, and it's interesting from the perspective of, how do I make putting the cyber domain as far forward as possible, constructing that domain, deploying those information resources, how do I do that in the easiest way possible while still making it very, very difficult for the adversary? Make it simple for us, make it very difficult for the adversary. And one of the ways that we typically do that is you're going to go, again, because this is coming from General Brown, the cartoon's coming right out of the Air Force Doctrine Center, so I'm going to leverage it, but I think everybody kind of gets the point. So how do we do that now? We want to start to establish whether it's forward operating stations or forward operating bases that are extensions. So we go right back to Karl von Clausewitz. These are extensions of the main operating base. Those forward forces need to reach back to the main operating base for information and resources. And we typically do that by deploying folks forward, and they're going to start to prep these locations. You're going to bring a whole lot of networking equipment in with you. You got SATCOM. Back in the day, we were moving 17 pallets of gear forward for an air base. A lot of hardware and a lot of equipment. Because what are we doing? We're building out these cyber lines of communication, and I want to own all of it. I need to be able to own all of it, and I'm going to take it with me. And I may have packed it up on those pallets, 3 weeks ago, maybe months ago, in anticipation of a deployment. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack all of this stuff, and I'm going to have to patch everything. Everything's going to have to be patched. So, sorry, not ready yet. I got to download a bunch of patches in order to bring up all of my hardware up to compliance, and that takes time. Of course, there's the need to reach back in order to get all of the patches and all the updates. And I'm not saying that there's a secret recipe on how we go and totally eliminate this, but what we want to do is we want to get to a place where access is not just about bringing your own hardware forward. Leveraging the cloud, for instance. Our ability to leverage local transport that could be available, and all I need is a destination, a cloud destination, and all the services are moving in this direction. Zero Trust makes this possible for us to start to move as much command and control information into the cloud, and I can do it in a way that becomes very agile. And that's really the secret here, is we have to be agile in order for us to deploy in a model like this that I think is going to become a big topic of conversation in the department, and the implementations are going to be happening across all the services, because the cloud just makes it a lot easier, and leveraging existing transport makes it even simpler for us, for our cyber warriors that are going to go forward in order to establish comms. And of course, you've got both the joint and the coalition aspect of this. And I'm going to go in, as promised, I want to talk about a use case where we can leverage some tools that can make zero trust access really quick and automated, so that you're not having to worry about, what identity provider, let's say, the coalition partner or that joint partner is bringing with them. How do I just get them access, because I can get them to an identity provider and then rapidly get zero trust access to the information that they need? Truth be told, this is not meant to be a marketing pitch, but I do come from Zscaler, so I do want to talk about how we go about doing this. You have a user, you have a device. That user has an identity, and you need through some kind of identity management tool, you have to be able to recognize the identity of that user. That individual is trying to get access to data, to applications, to some kind of a resource. From a Zscaler perspective, we want to push that data and create what is right here, that's our policy enforcement point. right out of 800-207. There's our policy enforcement point, and we're going to point that traffic to a. Excuse me. I'll get to where we're pointing the traffic to in a second. On the other end, we have an application connector, and that application connector is going to be pointing traffic in one direction. So both the client and the application are pointing traffic in one direction, and that direction is into a private access broker. And you see both the policy enforcement now depicted here on these connectors and policy decision making happening up at the broker. So right out of the 800-207 architecture. There's going to be a registration that's happening within the control plane where the application is letting the broker know, I'm here, this is where I exist. And that can be anywhere. That can be in any cloud. It could be in a data center somewhere. It doesn't matter. It's just a destination. And that application is letting the broker know, this is where I'm at. And if anybody's looking for me, this is where you'll find me. And the client connector then is also registering and saying, I'm a client, I'm within this infrastructure framework, and I will register myself with the broker. Once a request happens, the broker then can stitch together after policy decision making. So critical to this is understanding the context of the user, understanding the context of the device, understanding the health and status of the application. There could be something wonky with the application, and from a zero trust perspective, we don't want somebody to access that application if we're seeing something that doesn't look right. Once everything checks out, we stitch together a TLS connection from that user to that application, and then we monitor it. What's not happening is the application is not advertising its IP address. So we like to say if you're reachable, you're breachable. If you're public facing and you're announcing your IP address, you're a target. What happens in this case is that app connector is only communicating in one direction and only to that broker. The broker knows where that application is. Nobody else knows where that application is. The broker also handles all of the identity. So when that user initially logs on, the broker is going to look at that person and say, okay, your identity provider is Okta, your identity provider is Ping, and send that over to that identity provider for authorization. So we're just ingesting the results of that check that's happening from the IDAM, from the IDP provider specifically. The agent is also handling any kind of hygiene issues. So there may be telemetry coming off of the end user's device that we want to monitor. And all that goes into the risk scoring that's happening. So hey, there's something weird here, there's a patch level that hasn't been achieved, and so we want to go ahead and maybe throw some additional MFA at them. Or we may want to deny it totally. If that device has not had a certain patch put on it, no connectivity with any application will be permitted. All of that is being driven by policy. And then as I mentioned, the application here is not advertising out to the rest of the internet. So there's no way for an adversary to even see the application. And if you go to our booth down in number 800, there's a great demo that's being run on exactly what this looks like, to where the individual with the client connector can get access to the application, but if you were to ping that URL, you're not even going to see it. And that's key to zero trust, right? Now I have totally eliminated any ability for an adversary to see that application. So a little bit more about what we're doing from a Zscaler perspective. Terminating the connection, validating who the user is, any attributes associated with the user, we want to look at that. We're controlling content and access, so we're applying data loss prevention techniques and tools, all of the standard control access requirements that are needed that you would typically see in a very large cybersecurity stack. Think JRSS. If you know what's in that JRSS stack, all that is happening in memory, nothing is ever written to disk. but it's happening right here, and it's happening in memory, and it happens really, really fast. And then enforcing policy. Am I going to conditionally allow, or am I going to conditionally block access between this user and whatever application they're trying to get to? We kind of divide the world up into two different types of applications, either managed by you, managed by the customer, so that'd be applications that would be resident inside of a data center or in a cloud service provider where the customer has put that application there, or not managed by you. Think Office 365, think ServiceNow, think any of the SaaS applications that your customer could be using. Because frankly, the rules are a little bit different on how we want customers accessing the managed apps and the unmanaged apps. So back to the Zero Trust Exchange, just to kind of wrap it up. So we have 5 major tenants. This is the heart of our Zero Trust architecture. We're always assuming a hostile environment. We know those malicious activity is happening both inside and outside of the environment. That's why Zero Trust is what people are employing now. We're not going back. Nobody's going to ever say, we're not going to do Zero Trust anymore. They may come up with a cooler, snazzier term, but we're not going back. We're not going to turn around and say, oh, we were wrong. Actually, we were doing just fine protecting everything at the perimeter. We're doing fine by just protecting at the network layer. Those days are gone. So we have to assume a hostile environment that we're operating in. And again, going back to those cyber lines of communication, we have to figure out a way to work within this environment and be able to secure users and have that security follow the user no matter where they go on the globe. Presume a breach. DoD networks are being constantly bombarded and attacked. We have to be in a position to fight through that, and we're able to do that within the Zero Trust Exchange. Never trust, always verify, and scrutinize explicitly. So again, that comes down to, there is going to be a burden on the fact that the customer has to step in and start to make those policy management decisions and decide who should get access to what. Very difficult to kind of find a box that you can apply in your environment and say, well, this is going to make our policy. Maybe ChatGPT will figure that out or something, but we're not there yet. The customer's going to have to figure this out. And we enable that explicit scrutinization that's happening between the user and the application. Okay, so let me kind of start to pull everything together and use a coalition, joint, all-domain command and control example. As we've talked to different parts of the department, one of the things that comes up is that in some of these coalition environments, some of these customers don't have any kind of, they're not sophisticated enough to have their own enterprise identity provider system. And so they kind of have to, that has to be created for them. Back in the days where we build something like the Afghan Mission Network, obviously whatever the Afghan Mission Network is using as an IDP, that's what everybody's going to use. In Zero Trust, where you want to make it as easy for a coalition partner to get access to information, you do have to be able to provide them some kind of identity. And it's absolutely key in any Zero Trust architecture to have a good identity provider capability. So what we've done is we've worked with ServiceNow to create workflows that automate the process of creating those identities in order to get coalition partners access. And it just starts with if you're familiar with ServiceNow and how their workflows are set up, it's as simple as an email. You can provide an email to some sort of approval chop chain that will grant access for that coalition partner to get access to whatever applications. Again, not the network. We're not granting access to a network. We're granting access to the application that they need. So let's imagine that this is a sort of a fictitious, joint all-domain command and control application that all of the coalition partners are going to be using. Could be a common operational picture, It could be something that we want all of our coalition partners to have access to, but we want them to be able to have access from their own host network. We're not asking them to come and be a part of a brand new coalition network that we're going to build from the ground up. So a network comes in, an email comes in. This is the level of access that we want to grant for this individual. It goes through some kind of approval process. If there's something a little bit weird, we may have to elevate it to a higher level. And then depending on, and this is dealer's choice, I mean, you can use whatever you want. Active Directory is typically the one that most folks are using, so we can leverage Azure AD. We can leverage a local Active Directory that we eventually sync up with Azure AD if you are in a DDIL type environment and you need to get that identity established right away, and then you may get connectivity later on. Any of the normal identity provider requirements for MFA or PIV card or whatever those requirements are would be implemented at this point. And then an email would be sent back to the user saying, you're good to go. You now have access to whatever application that they should be able to have access to. And for those of you that like things kind of laid out, I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but I will summarize. First couple steps is an approval process. And then after that, we're going to create the identity in whatever IDP we want. And then we're going to grant zero trust access for that individual once that identity is approved. And then finally, the user is able to log in to the application. And all that is done automatically. It's just leveraging an ITSM like ServiceNow in order to grant that access, leveraging whatever IDP you want to leverage. And once you have that, this, of course, is another drawing of all of the stuff that's happening within the Zero Trust Exchange that is going to securely grant access for that user to that JADC2 application. And our tagline, of course, if our public sector CTO was here, is if you're reachable, you're breachable. I think it works great. If we had a merch store, this is what our shirt would look like, and I'd love to hand them all out to you guys, but we don't have any of that, so sorry. And no inbound connections. And really, it's protection from a zero-day attack, because remember, we're not leveraging the TCP three-way handshake in order to get somebody access to an application. All that is being done without any visibility from the internet. And I think that is my last slide. How are we doing on time? So we got a few minutes for questions. We got 10 minutes for questions. And I've been instructed to ask you, so thank you very much for volunteering to ask a question, but could you come up to the microphone and ask it, because they are recording it. Yeah, give them a dose of their own medicine. And then the mic's not even turned on. That's got to be weird, like you're having... Yeah. I tell you what, go ahead and ask. I'll just repeat it.
Can you go to slide 13?
Slide 13. Tell me when to stop. So in the ACE slide.
Oh, no, I guess it was really for the folder. It was talking about basically how you wanted to have the controller in the middle between the application and whatever the user was.
Right.
How do you prevent that from becoming a single point of failure on a network?
Yeah. So great question. The question was from a broker perspective. Yeah. The broker that is the inline proxy between the user and the application, how do you prevent that from being the target? And so there's a variety of things. First of all, I mean that's what we do, right? So that's our focus, is securing that infrastructure. And from a Zscaler perspective, we've got 150 of these data centers that are global. From a FedRAMP perspective, we have 3 of those because just the FedRAMP IL5 rules require us to have a couple of these that are CONUS-based. So the way to think about it is from a continuity of operations perspective, we have a robust amount of failover protections that are in place for the broker itself. It's never going to be a single point of failure because there's always other brokers that would step in order to carry on the mission. So from if you're thinking like a DDoS attack or something like that against our cloud infrastructure, we're robust enough to handle that, and because our global footprint, we're able to offload any of that work to any. And I do have to give a shout out to Conrad Maiorino. He's a cyber mission engineer at Zscaler, so if I either say anything wrong or it's a very technical question, Conrad's going to bail me out. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything?
You can have your own private brokers.
Yeah.
That can be taken from our cloud, put on-prem when we extend it on. They will only be used for you. Also, what we call is a shard, where we make the cloud just for you. Your tenant, only you're allowed to use it, no one else can use it, on it out that way. So there, we normally do whatever the network is, plus X, plus N, if you will. So if there's a 200 gig network, we will have enough brokers for 200 gig worth of 200. This hypothetically speaking, your
Okay.
So.
required. We would do the 200 plus 10. In the end, this helps us make changes in the middle of the day without affecting your user experience.
Okay.
Because we have more than what the bandwidth requires.
So I'm going to repeat what he just said without the cool New York accent, just to get it on. But in addition to globally the cloud infrastructure, we also have what we call a private service edge that would also be deployed locally within the environment. And then that would be some added level of security if that's the requirement. And it also makes a lot of sense from the perspective of saving latency if we're worried about, do I have to go all the way to the cloud when what I need to access is inside of 3 buildings over. You could put a private service edge there. You get all the benefits of the cloud, but it's local to the customer.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Conrad. Yeah, private service edge is a great answer. Yes, sir.
So his question was my question.
Oh,
Also, so for the implementation of this, that your broker installs somewhere, where are the agents?
so the question is,
Does it have to reside with both the end user device and at the application?
yeah, great question. So the question is about the agents, which in our vernacular is the client connector. So the Zscaler client connector is a very lightweight agent that's sitting on the device, and its job, and that's one way you can get there. There's another way I'll talk about in a second. But the client connector's only job is to point traffic to the broker. So there's not a lot required there from a computing capacity standpoint. That's what makes it very lightweight. There's some telemetry information, like I said, about when we're assessing risk on the device. There's some telemetry information that the client connector is sending up to the broker, but it's very lightweight. And so that's on one side. You can also leverage Zscaler Zero Trust Access through a browser. So limited to web-based applications, but you can also do it through a browser if you don't want to use a client connector at all. And then on the other side, that's the application connector. And the application connector does something similar in that it's pointing all of the traffic to the broker. It's a one-way communication. It's an inside-out communication only. And that's what prevents adversaries from seeing the IP address of the application. So
Those connectors are in line during the comms, right?
those connectors are in line.
With the live communication between the application and the client.
So if I understand the question, so they are in line, they are within our control plane, and they're basically just, they're not in the data plane. They're in the control plane. So they're just checking, hey, is somebody looking for me? Is somebody looking for me? Is somebody looking for me? It's not until all the decision making in those earlier steps is accomplished. Device, good. User, good. application good, all of that's happening from a control plane perspective. When data starts to transit, that is another tunnel that's created, another TLS tunnel that's created for data to be allowed to transfer.
But that tunnel does go through the controller basically for the behavioral analysis.
Yes, through the broker, that's correct. And then again, as I mentioned, kind of look at the world as unmanaged apps and managed apps. Unmanaged apps, where we're really concerned about, what could be getting downloaded. We're really scrutinizing that traffic, but we're doing it in memory. It's happening really quickly. All of that typical JRSS security appliance kind of stuff has been put into, it's a virtual machine. It's all operating in memory. Everything's firing simultaneously from your AV, your DLP, your IDS, IPS. All of that is happening simultaneously, and then we're getting that traffic on the wire. Thank you. You and then you.
What I remember of the NIST team, they described some of the scenarios for putting this together to include collapsing the control of the data plane together. When you do that, what sort of challenges do you run into, or do you know your solutions?
So the question is around
Three different scenarios.
collapsing the control in the data plane.
And the administrator will put it into one device.
So I think you're right. I think NIST was giving industry options on how they could deploy it. I don't think they were being prescriptive about the control and data plane having to be separate. However, from our perspective, it makes a lot of sense for them to be separate. The control and data plane makes a lot more sense to be separated, and that's how we've implemented our architecture. They do not collapse them together. They coexist. They could be in the same cloud environment, but they are operating independent of each other. Yes, sir. There's a question over here.
Just going to ask, just so I understand a little bit. This is more like an authentication server. Yes or no?
So
You authenticate there to get access to an application?
So Zscaler is not doing the authentication. So the very first step in implementing zero trust connectivity is to, I've got a better slide right here, is to leverage the local IDP. So what would happen is you are requesting access to an application, right? Zscaler sees that request come in. We hand you off to whatever IDP is that you're using. And then what comes back to us that we ingest is the result of that, of your IDP authorizing you. You follow me? Is there, Conrad, is there a better way to yeah, does that make sense? So we're leveraging whatever IDP is already existing. Now, we do have the capability to be, but it doesn't scale. I mean, if you have a small amount of users and we're doing like a proof of value for a customer, we're just showing them, hey, this is, let's take 50 users, get them access to these 10 applications. We can build ourselves the IDP for authorization, but it wouldn't scale, and we expect the customer to have an IDP that we leverage. All right?
You actually break zero trust if you keep the identity in the actual place that you're doing the transport. That breaks zero trust.
Good point.
It has to be outside. Like, for example, when Okta got breached, we had the Okta, if we were the Okta, you were already in. So you have to have the separation in order not to break zero.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the point that Conrad was making there is that there is an added level of security that comes from having the IDP independent of your control plane and your data plane for zero trust enforcement and access. Yes, sir.
Just quickly, are you seeing any policies where they're allowing access to a particular application, but granularly allowing only access to certain data within the app?
Yeah, I kind of consider that the next ridge line, to be honest with you. From a Zscaler perspective, you know, we've got application access down cold. I mean, that's what we do. As you start to get more and more granular and you start to say, well, I want them to have access to the application, but only, you know, these databases, and within these databases, only these cells. You know, that to me is like the next ridge line. And we've had companies that are in that business talking to us, and I think as a part of a even broader, more holistic solution, you know, that to me is where we've been chasing this, you know, holy grail for a long time around multi-level security, especially in the coalition environment, right? I want the Indians to see this, but I don't want the Pakistanis to know that the Indians are seeing it. But I need a place, you know, a single source for truth, and I just need to deny access. And so it's coming, and we're ready from a Zscaler perspective. Being able to apply our policy enforcement against those decisions with a tool that can get into the data tagging necessary for us to be able to do that enforcement. I mean, that's really great stuff right there when you get to that point. And it's coming. Yes, sir.
So with the stance of reduction of physical architecture being structured, right? I guess what's your take on the acceptance of risk for passive monitoring of that infrastructure, right? Association to monitoring of the DoD, especially with, I understand it's encrypted, but with the stance of quantum computers upcoming, right? It's going to be an issue of encryption later on down the road.
Yep.
So what's the question for that, I guess?
I mean, we're going to leverage the latest and greatest in industry standard encryption. So, I mean, you know, we certainly are monitoring, and we've got, as a matter of fact, at the VP level in our company, we've got somebody that's following a lot of the quantum cryptography discussions that are going on. So it's really important to us, but you would see us being able to leverage what industry is doing as opposed to driving that ourselves. That's not necessarily in our wheelhouse.
So with the, I guess as a follow-on question, with the access of the application client side to the information, right, from a third-party entity, if you will, right, so whatever forces we're working with, is there not concern of access of data on that local host asset, rather they're doing like BYOD or any kind of stuff like that, where it's like minimization of expanding of the architecture, right? Because my concern is that, yes, we're doing zero trust within X boundary of us, but once that boundary stops and access to that data, because that data is living in memory within the box, right? It is, like, undeniable. So with that, is there not concern for that? I just kind of don't understand the stance of reducing the infrastructure, right? Like that's my concern, is the reduction of footprint of the infrastructure. Because I do understand that, like, if you can touch it, right, like you can't secure fully, but on the counter side of that coin is that security is like an onion, right? So network by itself can't stop it, but network plus X plus X plus X can stop, right?
So I heard a couple questions in there. There's sort of, by the way, for those of you that have to leave, booth 800, number 800 is where we're at, and happy to go into any more detail that you guys would like to get into about Zscaler specifically. Happy to do that. But so reducing infrastructure, you know, I talk a lot about from a control content and access perspective. There's a whole lot of infrastructure that goes into the DoD networks today in order to do that. So there is an immediate reduction in appliances from that perspective, because we're doing it in memory, and you're able to remove boxes that way. And then your question around, like, what I heard was, if that application is breached somehow, and you have created that tunnel, because everything looks normal on the application. So I'm assuming this malware is so sophisticated that I cannot even see it causing wonkiness in the application. So everything looks normal.
Okay, the application monitoring, right? Depending on EDR solution you're doing, EDRs can't manage everything or can't monitor every API.
Right.
You can't because of crash blocks.
Right.
So saying that an application is watching or a process is watching where you can't watch isn't crazy, right? I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't think we are doing that. Are you tracking that?
So it all depends on if there's malware running on that endpoint. Yeah. And you have an EDR that knows that that's the endpoint and it has a zero trust score, and the zero trust score stops our hit checks or continuous compliant connect, will force that user to get removed from that data. That's something that we do. Or if we're talking about if you're worried that something you think is breached, we can switch to a read-only browser isolation of that app where everything is happening disconnected in an air-gapped environment in our cloud, and just a streaming pixel is sent to that endpoint. So there's no uploading, there's no downloading, there's no printing, there's no rendering, there's nothing. That person just sees a pixel read-only image of what's going on in that environment. Web page, app, or whatever. We can provide that. That's mostly for unmanaged devices, for when you're dealing with your MPE, JWICS stuff. And if they're bad actors, and they take a picture of the screen, the next iteration will have their name embedded in the picture. So if they give it out, they know it's them. Okay. So
All right.
That's the best way to get that happening there. And to answer your quantum resistant algorithms and stuff like that, the problem with a VPN is I have an open listener. You're bringing a user to the security saying, knock, here's my 0 day, or here's my quantum way of getting in. Zscaler does not have an open listener that's front-ending or proxying your application. All inbound connections are dropped. But it does talk from client to either direct data source to broker via IP, right? So what will happen is that app connector is a mutually authenticated certificate PIN connection inside out to the broker. It is not allowed to speak to anything else but the brokers that are part of your tenant. But it reaches the broker via socket, right? Yes.
Those are NAT carrier non-routable IP addresses.
So for me, the endpoint that's getting that app, and that app is living somewhere, AWS IL6 cloud, and it's 10.10.117. Me, the end user getting that app, is a 164 NAT carrier address. Okay. They have no idea where that app lives. They just have a connection to it. Okay. Yeah, I'll talk to you guys offline, sorry. Great questions.
For those of you that stayed, thank you very much.
Thank you.